She had 30 seconds to save a life. That's when the handcuffs clicked. Inside the hospital where she worked, police officers surrounded her, not to protect, but to arrest. The patient was dying 3 floors up. The CEO who ordered her arrest was watching from his office window, smiling. What she didn't know was that he'd forged documents, planted evidence, and destroyed her reputation before she even knew what hit her. The patient would survive, but would never walk again. And this brilliant nurse? She'd lose everything. But 8 months later, a single security camera would expose a conspiracy so dark it would bring down everyone involved. This is what happens when power thinks it's untouchable. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. November 14th, 2:17 in the afternoon. St. Augustine Medical Center, 3rd floor ICU wing. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual sterile melody while nurses moved through their rotations with practiced efficiency. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were supposed to be predictable. Sarah Mitchell's pager erupted against her hip with a sound that made her blood turn cold. Code blue. Room 347. She didn't need to read the details. Her fingers were already moving, her mind already calculating. Mr. Johnson, 72 years old. Diabetic. Post-surgical complications from Friday's procedure. She'd checked on him just 40 minutes ago. His vitals had been stable. Stable, but fragile. Cardiovascular distress. The words on the pager screen might as well have been a countdown timer. When a heart starts to fail, the brain has maybe 3 minutes before irreversible damage begins. Maybe 2 if the patient's already compromised. Mr. Johnson was already compromised. Sarah's shoes hit the polished linoleum in a rhythm she'd perfected over 8 years of emergencies. Her hand reached for the crash cart stationed at the nurse's hub without breaking stride. She knew this hallway like she knew her own heartbeat. 47 steps from the 3rd floor station to room 347. She'd counted them 1,000 times during night shifts when insomnia made her restless. The crash cart's wheels rattled behind her. Equipment secured. Defibrillator charged. She mentally ran through the protocol she could perform in her sleep. Airway, breathing, circulation. The holy trinity of emergency response. Mr. Johnson's daughter had been sitting with him all morning. Sarah hoped to God she'd stepped out for coffee. 32 steps to go. That's when she heard them. Footsteps. Heavy. Multiple. Moving fast, but not with the urgency of medical personnel. Something else. Something wrong. The sound echoed off the walls in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. Sarah's peripheral vision caught the movement first. 2 figures in dark uniforms emerging from the elevator bay. Not security. Police. 2 officers. Their faces set in that particular expression of grim determination she'd seen before when they brought in prisoners for medical treatment. But they weren't bringing anyone in. They were walking toward her. 20 steps to room 347. Ma'am, stop right there. The command cut through the hallway like a blade. Sarah's momentum faltered. Her brain couldn't process what was happening. Mr. Johnson, room 347. Code blue. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to keep moving. I have a patient coding, she started, already turning back toward the room, toward the emergency, toward where she was needed. The officer's hand closed around her upper arm. Firm. Unmistakable. Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for theft of hospital property. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, like someone speaking a foreign language. The crash cart was still in her other hand. Her pager was still screaming its silent emergency. Somewhere behind her, she could hear other nurses beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. There's a patient dying upstairs. Her voice cracked. Professional composure fracturing. Please, I need to. The second officer moved to her other side. She felt the cold metal of handcuffs circle her wrist before her mind could fully comprehend what was happening. Click. The sound was small but absolute. Final. You have the right to remain silent. Down the hallway, she could see room 347's door. Closed. She knew what was happening behind that door. Mr. Johnson's heart struggling. His organs beginning to shut down. Every second she stood here was a second he didn't have. Please. The word came out as barely a whisper. Someone is dying. I'm a nurse. You have to let me. The officer's face remained stone. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Other nurses had frozen in the hallway. Dr. Chin stood in the doorway of the break room. his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips, eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah made eye contact with him. "Room 347, she said urgently. "Mr. Johnson. Code blue. Someone has to." But she was already being turned around, being walked in the opposite direction, away from room 347, away from Mr. Johnson, away from everything that mattered. In his office on the 4th floor, Marcus Thornton stood by his window overlooking the 3rd floor ICU wing. He watched the scene unfold below him with the careful attention of an architect admiring his work. And he smiled. Sarah Mitchell never made it to room 347. But to understand why this happened, you need to know who Sarah Mitchell was. And more importantly, why one man feared her enough to destroy her. Sarah didn't come from money. She didn't come from privilege. She came from Millbrook, a town in rural Pennsylvania where the population sign still read 1243 and where leaving meant something. Her father worked at the lumber mill for 32 years until it closed. Her mother cleaned houses for families who could afford to pay someone else to scrub their floors. When Sarah told them she wanted to be a nurse, they didn't ask how. They asked when she'd start. She worked 3 jobs to get through nursing school. Morning shift at the diner on Route 9, slinging eggs and coffee to truckers who left dollar tips. Afternoons at the public library, reshelving books in the quiet that helped her study. Nights at the 24-hour gas station where she memorized anatomy textbooks between customers and kept pepper spray under the counter. For years of sleeping 5 hours a night. For years of instant ramen and secondhand scrubs. For years of professors who told her she had something special, not just intelligence, but instinct. The kind you can't teach. She graduated top of her class. Not because she was naturally brilliant, though she was sharp as they come. But because she worked harder than everyone else. Because giving up wasn't in her vocabulary. Because when you come from a town like Millbrook, you learn early that nobody's going to hand you anything. St. Augustine Medical Center hired her 8 years ago. She started on the night shift like everyone does. The graveyard hours when the hospital feels like a different world, when skeleton crews handle emergencies with whatever resources they have. Sarah thrived there. While other nurses counted down the minutes until sunrise, she learned. She watched. She asked questions that made the veteran doctors take notice. Within 2 years, she'd moved to day shift in the ICU. Within 4, doctors were specifically requesting her for their critical patients. Not because she followed orders blindly, but because she thought. Because she anticipated. Because she gave a damn. Patients loved her. Not in the casual way people appreciate good service, but in the deep way you love someone who sees you as a human being when you're at your most vulnerable. She remembered their names. Their grandchildren's names. She stayed after her shift to hold the hand of a woman whose family couldn't make it in time. She brought in photos printed from her own phone to help a man with dementia remember his wedding day. But it was her voice that made her truly remarkable. And ultimately, truly dangerous. Sarah spoke up. When something wasn't right, she said so. Not loudly, not rudely, but firmly and without apology. When a resident prescribed the wrong dosage, she questioned it. When equipment wasn't being properly sterilized, she reported it. When corners were being cut that put patients at risk, she refused to stay silent. 3 years ago, she caught a medication error that would have killed a 6-year-old boy. The pharmacy had labeled digoxin at 10 times the prescribed dose. The ordering physician hadn't noticed. The attending nurse hadn't noticed. Sarah noticed. She stopped the injection with seconds to spare. The child went home 2 days later with his parents, completely unaware that he'd almost never left that hospital alive. The hospital gave her a commendation, put her photo in the newsletter, called her a hero. What they didn't put in the newsletter was that the error had happened because the hospital had recently cut pharmacy staff to save money. Because corners were being cut. Because profit margins mattered more than safety margins. Sarah knew that. And worse, she wasn't afraid to say it. That voice, that refusal to stay silent, would become her biggest threat. Marcus Thornton didn't become CEO of a major hospital by caring about patients. He got there by caring about money, power, and his reputation. His background wasn't in medicine. It was in business. Corporate restructuring, to be specific. He'd spent 15 years climbing the ladder at various healthcare corporations, learning how to make balance sheets look beautiful while the services they represented withered. He had an MBA from Wharton and a vocabulary full of words like optimization, streamlining, and operational efficiency. Words that sounded impressive in boardrooms, but translated to something very different on hospital floors. When St. Augustine's previous CEO retired, the board didn't look for a doctor. They didn't look for someone who understood patient care. They looked for someone who could make the numbers work, someone who could attract investors, someone who spoke the language of quarterly returns and shareholder value. They found Marcus Thornton. Within 6 months of his arrival, he'd cut the pharmacy staff by 30%, reduced ICU nurses from a 1-to-2 patient ratio to 1-to-3, eliminated the patient advocacy office entirely, switched to cheaper medical suppliers whose equipment failed just often enough to be concerning, but not often enough to trigger regulatory scrutiny. Every decision came wrapped in the same justification: financial sustainability. As if compassion and solvency were somehow mutually exclusive. The board loved him. Wall Street analysts praised his aggressive cost management. His salary doubled. But something unexpected started happening. Despite his carefully crafted presentations and his polished reassurances, the people who actually worked in the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, the staff who kept patients alive, they started losing faith. Not in the hospital, in him. And they started turning to someone else. Sarah Mitchell. It began subtly. A doctor would consult her about a patient's care plan during morning rounds. Another would ask her opinion on a treatment protocol. Patients would request her specifically, even when she wasn't assigned to their floor. Her name came up in staff meetings, in safety reviews, in quality assessments. Board members started hearing about her. The nurse who caught the medication error. The nurse whose patients had the lowest complication rates. The nurse who somehow made the third-floor ICU function like a well-oiled machine despite the staffing cuts. Thornton noticed. At first, it was just irritation. A minor annoyance that a staff nurse was getting attention that should have been directed at leadership. At him. But irritation grew into something darker when he realized the respect she commanded wasn't just recognition. It was influence. Real influence. The kind that made people listen when she spoke. The kind that made his carefully constructed corporate narrative start to crack. Doctors consulted her before implementing his policy changes. Nurses brought concerns to her that should have gone through official channels he controlled. Patients and their families praised her in reviews while subtly criticizing the hospital's administrative decisions. She'd become an alternative center of gravity in an institution he was supposed to command absolutely. Marcus Thornton had a fragile ego wrapped in expensive suits and rehearsed confidence. He needed to be the smartest person in every room, the most respected, the most powerful. And here was a nurse who people trusted more than they trusted him. It was intolerable. The breaking point came 3 months before that November afternoon. A quarterly board meeting. Investors present. Thornton presenting his proposal to further reduce ICU staffing levels. More efficiency. Better margins. The numbers looked fantastic on the projected slides. Then Sarah Mitchell, invited to provide a clinical perspective, stood up and calmly explained why the proposal would kill people. Not might. Would. She used data. She used case studies. She used the language of patient outcomes and mortality rates. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. 2 board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An investor asked pointed questions about liability. The hospital's legal counsel requested a follow-up meeting. Thornton's proposal was tabled. In front of investors. In front of the board. His plan, his carefully constructed, beautifully presented plan, had been dismantled by a nurse in scrubs who'd been called in to rubber stamp his expertise. He smiled through the rest of the meeting, thanked her for her input, assured everyone they'd find a compromise. But inside, something cold and calculated had already begun taking shape. That meeting sealed her fate. Thornton began planning. What happened next wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. Thornton didn't act in anger. Anger is impulsive, sloppy, easy to trace back to its source. No, what he did required patience. Planning. The kind of cold deliberation that separates revenge from destruction. He started with the hospital's inventory system. As CEO, he had access to everything: supply records, equipment logs, procurement databases. Systems designed to prevent theft and ensure accountability. Systems he was about to weaponize. Over the course of 6 weeks, Thornton carefully modified inventory records. A few items here and there. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger automatic audits. Medical equipment that could plausibly go missing in the chaos of a busy hospital. For pumps, portable monitors, surgical instruments. He created a pattern, a digital paper trail showing equipment disappearing from locked supply rooms. Then he did something brilliant in its cruelty. He altered the access logs. Every supply room required badge authorization. Every time a staff member entered, the system recorded their ID, the timestamp, the duration. Thornton went into those logs and inserted Sarah's badge number at odd hours. 2 in the morning, 4 a.m., times when she wasn't even working, when the hospital was quiet and few people would notice someone moving equipment. The forgeries were meticulous, professional. The kind of fabrication that would hold up under initial scrutiny, because why would anyone question the CEO's record-keeping? Why would anyone suspect the man at the top of the organization chart was manufacturing evidence against one of his own nurses? But creating false records wasn't enough. Thornton needed enforcement. He needed people willing to make an arrest based on his word alone. People who wouldn't ask too many questions or dig too deeply into the evidence. People whose loyalty could be purchased. He found them in Officers Bradley and Martinez. 2 cops with just enough complaints in their personnel files to make them vulnerable. Just enough financial pressure, child support, gambling debts. The kind of problems that make men desperate, to make them receptive. Thornton didn't approach them directly. That would leave traces. Instead, he used intermediaries. Conversations in parking lots. Cash in unmarked envelopes. Promises of future favors. The arrangement was simple. When he made the call, they'd make the arrest. No delays. No questions. No mercy. Now came the timing. Thornton could have had Sarah arrested quietly. A knock on her apartment door on her day off. A discreet escort from the parking lot before her shift. But that wasn't the point. The point wasn't just to remove her. It was to humiliate her. To break her. To make an example so complete that no one else would ever dare challenge him again. He studied her schedule. Learned her patterns. Discovered that she had a special investment in certain patients. And then he found the perfect moment. Mr. Johnson, 72 years old. Post-surgical patient. High-risk cardiac complications. Sarah had been monitoring him closely, adjusting his care plan, communicating with his family. She'd scheduled herself specifically to be available during his recovery window. Thornton scheduled the arrest for that exact day. That exact time window when a code blue was most likely. When Sarah would be most needed. When her absence would cause the most damage. It wasn't enough to destroy her professionally. He wanted to make her feel responsible for whatever happened to that patient. Wanted the guilt to eat at her even after the legal charges. Wanted her to lie awake at night wondering if things would have been different if she'd just kept her mouth shut in that board meeting. This wasn't just career assassination. It was psychological warfare. Everything was in place. The forged documents. The corrupted access logs. The officers on standby. The timing calibrated for maximum devastation. If you believe people in power should be held accountable, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when they think they're untouchable. Comment, "Justice matters" if you're ready to see this through. On November 14th, Thornton's plan went into motion. And Sarah Mitchell had no idea what was coming. 2:17 in the afternoon. Sarah's pager went off with the sound every medical professional dreads. Code blue. Room 347. Mr. Johnson. Her body moved before her conscious mind fully processed the words. 8 years of training, 8 years of emergencies, had built pathways in her nervous system that bypassed thought entirely. Her feet hit the floor in a run. Her hands reached for the crash cart at the nurse's station without looking. Muscle memory. Survival instinct. The difference between life and death measured in seconds. The crash cart's wheels scraped against the linoleum as she pulled it into motion. Defibrillator. Intubation kit. Emergency medications. Everything needed to restart a dying heart. The weight of it barely registered. Adrenaline had taken over. Room 347 was down the main corridor, past the supply closet, past the staff break room, past the elevator bank. 47 steps. She'd counted them so many times she could navigate them blind. Her mind was already running through protocols. Airway assessment. Cardiac rhythm analysis. Possible complications from his diabetes, from his recent surgery, from his age. Mr. Johnson's face flashed through her memory. Kind eyes. Worried but trusting. His daughter holding his hand that morning, asking Sarah if he was going to be okay. Sarah had smiled and said they were watching him closely. She'd meant it as reassurance. Now he was dying. 30 steps to go. Her breathing was controlled despite the sprint. She'd learned years ago how to run without losing the steady calm required for emergency intervention. Panic killed patients. Composure saved them. That's when the elevator doors opened. 2 police officers stepped into the hallway. Uniforms dark against the pale hospital walls. Their expressions weren't concerned or confused like officers typically looked when responding to a hospital call. They looked purposeful, determined. They were walking directly toward her. Sarah's stride faltered for a fraction of a second. Confusion rippled through the adrenaline. But room 347 was ahead. Mr. Johnson was coding. Nothing else mattered. She kept moving. "Ma'am, stop right there." The command was sharp. Official. The voice of authority that expected immediate obedience. Sarah's feet stopped, but her hands stayed on the crash cart. "I have a patient coding," she said, her voice urgent but professional. "I need to get to Sarah Mitchell." The officer's hand moved to his belt. Not to his weapon. To his handcuffs. "Yes, but there's an emergency." She gestured toward room 347. Every second of this conversation was a second Mr. Johnson didn't have. "Someone is dying. I'm a nurse. I have to." The second officer moved to her side, faster than she expected. His hand closed around her upper arm. Firm. Unyielding. "Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for theft of hospital property." The words hit her like physical objects. Theft. Arrest. The concepts were so foreign, so completely disconnected from the reality of this moment, that her brain couldn't process them. This had to be a mistake. A miscommunication. Some absurd confusion that would be cleared up in 10 seconds, so she could get to room 347. "I don't understand," she said, trying to pull her arm free. Not violently. Just urgently. "There's a patient dying upstairs. Code blue. Room 347. Cardiac arrest. I need to respond. You can arrest me after, just let me." Cold metal circled her wrist. The handcuff closed with a click that seemed impossibly loud in the corridor. Final. Absolute. "You have the right to remain silent." "No." The word came out strangled. "No, you don't understand. Mr. Johnson is 72 years old. He has maybe 2 minutes before brain damage. Maybe less. Please. I'm begging you. Let me save him first. You can arrest me after. I won't run. I promise I won't run. Just let me." The second handcuff clicked into place. Her hands were behind her back now. Useless. The crash cart stood abandoned beside her, all its life-saving equipment suddenly as worthless as if it didn't exist. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Down the corridor, other staff members had begun to notice. Nurse Peterson stood frozen in the doorway of the supply room, her mouth open. Dr. Chun had emerged from the break room, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. A patient's family members stared from the waiting area, confusion and concern written across their face. Sarah twisted to look at them. Room 347. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Dr. Chun, please. Mr. Johnson. Code blue. Someone has to." But they were already turning her around. Already walking her in the opposite direction. Away from room 347. Away from the emergency. Away from the patient whose heart was stopping while she stood here in handcuffs explaining rights she didn't care about. "You have the right to an attorney." She could hear the alarm still sounding. Could picture Mr. Johnson's body in that bed, his chest still, his daughter probably in the cafeteria getting coffee, unaware that her father was dying. Sarah had promised to watch over him. She'd promised. "Please," she whispered. The fight had drained out of her voice, replaced by something that sounded like breaking. "He's dying. Someone's father is dying. Don't you understand? I'm a nurse. Saving lives is what I do. It's who I am. Please don't make me." They walked her past the nurse's station, past colleagues who'd worked beside her for years, now standing helpless, unsure what to do, past patients in wheelchairs who stared with wide eyes, past visitors who pulled back as if arrest might be contagious. On the 4th floor, Marcus Thornton stood at his office window. From his vantage point, he could see the 3rd floor corridor through the interior glass walls. Could see Sarah in handcuffs being led away. Could see the crash cart sitting abandoned in the hallway. He lifted his coffee cup to his lips and took a slow sip. His phone buzzed. A text from the ICU supervisor. Code blue room 347. Mitchell arrested. Waiting for available nurse. Thornton set down his coffee and returned to his desk. He had emails to answer. Calls to return. A hospital to run. By the time another nurse reached room 347, it was too late. Mr. Johnson survived. But survival isn't the same as being whole. When Nurse Peterson finally reached room 347, 4 minutes and 18 seconds had passed since the code blue was called. In cardiac emergencies, that's an eternity. She found Mr. Johnson unconscious, his heart in ventricular fibrillation, his lips already taking on the blue tinge of oxygen deprivation. She started compressions immediately, called for backup, did everything by the book. They got his heart beating again, shocked it back into rhythm with the defibrillator, stabilized his vitals, rushed him to emergency surgery when they discovered the real problem. A blood clot that had formed post-operatively had broken loose during the cardiac episode. The clot traveled. That's what clots do when a heart stops pumping properly and then restarts. They move through the vascular system like debris in a river after a dam breaks. Mr. Johnson's clot traveled down, away from his heart, away from his lungs where it might have killed him instantly. It traveled to his left leg. By the time the surgical team got him on the table, the clot had completely blocked the femoral artery. No blood flow to the lower leg. Tissue dying. Cells suffocating. The kind of damage that spreads like wildfire once it starts. Dr. Reynolds, the vascular surgeon, spent 3 hours trying to save it. Used every technique in his arsenal. Clot retrieval, arterial bypass, tissue revascularization. But the damage had progressed too far. The delay had been too long. When tissue dies, there's no bringing it back. And dead tissue left in the body becomes poison. They amputated below the knee. Dr. Reynolds wrote in his surgical notes, with the careful language doctors use when they're documenting something that might end up in court. Delay in initial cardiac response likely contributed to clot migration and subsequent arterial occlusion. Earlier intervention may have prevented amputation. May have. The word doctors use when they mean would have, but can't say it outright. Later, much later, independent medical experts would review the case. They'd be more direct. 90 seconds. That's how much earlier Sarah would have reached room 347 if she hadn't been stopped. 90 seconds of compressions before the clot broke loose. 90 seconds that would have kept that clot stable until they could retrieve it surgically. 90 seconds was the difference between Mr. Johnson walking out of that hospital and leaving in a wheelchair with a prosthetic limb on order. His daughter Rachel was in the cafeteria when it happened. She'd gone down for coffee because Sarah had told her that morning that her father was stable, that it was okay to take a break, that Sarah would be watching over him. When Rachel got back to the 3rd floor, her father's room was empty, cleaned, the bed stripped. For a horrible moment, she thought he'd died. A nurse she didn't recognize, not Sarah, gently explained about the cardiac event, the surgery, the amputation. Rachel stood in that hallway and tried to understand how her father had gone from stable to missing a leg in the span of a 20-minute coffee break. "Where's Sarah?" she asked. She said she'd watch him. "Where is she?" The nurse's face did something complicated. "She's not available." When Mr. Johnson woke up in recovery, groggy from anesthesia, his first words were asking for water. His second words were asking for Sarah. He trusted her. Wanted her to explain what had happened in words he could understand. Wanted her steady presence to help him process the fact that his left leg ended at the knee now. They told him she wasn't there. Didn't explain why. Just said another nurse would be taking over his care. He would find out 3 days later, from a news broadcast playing in his hospital room, that Sarah Mitchell had been arrested for theft, that she'd been removed from the hospital in handcuffs, that she was fired and facing criminal charges. He would weep, not for his leg, for her. Sarah learned about Mr. Johnson's amputation from a jail cell. She'd been processed, fingerprinted, photographed like a criminal. Spent the night on a concrete bench that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Her bail hearing wasn't until the next morning. No phone call to family because her family was 8 hours away in Millbrook and couldn't afford to help anyway. Her assigned public defender mentioned it almost casually while reviewing the charges. "There was a patient emergency during your arrest. Cardiac event. Unfortunately, there were complications." "Mr. Johnson?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't have a name. But apparently there was a delay in response, and the patient lost a leg. The hospital is trying to keep it quiet, but it's going to complicate things. They're going to argue you abandoned your duties." The lawyer kept talking. Something about bail amounts and court dates and plea negotiations. Sarah didn't hear any of it. All she could hear was the sound of her pager going off. Code blue. Room 347. All she could see was Mr. Johnson's kind face, his daughter's trusting eyes. He'd lost his leg because she'd been arrested, because she'd been stopped from doing her job, because someone had decided that fake theft charges were more important than a man's life. She put her head in her hands and broke. Completely. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness. From the place where your sense of self lives. Sarah Mitchell was a nurse. Saving lives was her identity, her purpose, the thing that made sense of everything else. And she'd failed. It didn't matter that it wasn't her fault. It didn't matter that she'd been in handcuffs, that she'd begged to be allowed to help. Mr. Johnson had needed her, and she hadn't been there. That guilt would live in her chest like a stone for months. Years, maybe. But this injury would become the key piece of evidence that would eventually expose everything. Thornton didn't just want Sarah arrested. He wanted her destroyed. Within 2 hours of her being taken from the hospital in handcuffs, St. Augustine Medical Center released an official statement. Carefully worded, legally vetted, devastating in its brevity. A former employee has been arrested on charges of theft of hospital property. St. Augustine Medical Center is cooperating fully with law enforcement. Due to the ongoing investigation, we cannot comment further at this time. Former employee. Past tense. She'd been fired before the handcuffs had even been removed. The local news picked it up for the evening broadcast. Breaking news tonight. A nurse at St. Augustine Medical Center has been arrested for allegedly stealing hospital equipment. Sarah Mitchell, a registered nurse who'd worked at the facility for 8 years, was taken into custody this afternoon. Details are still emerging, but sources say the theft may have involved thousands of dollars worth of medical supplies. They showed her mugshot. The photo taken in the processing room, where the fluorescent lights washed out all warmth and made everyone look guilty. Sarah's eyes were red from crying. Her hair disheveled. Her scrubs. The same scrubs she'd been wearing when she was racing to save Mr. Johnson, wrinkled and stained. That image went everywhere. Local news websites. Social media. Shared and reshared with commentary ranging from outrage to schadenfreude. Within 24 hours, if you searched her name, that mugshot was the first thing you'd see. Not her commendation for saving that child's life. Not her 8 years of dedicated service. Just that photo that made her look like exactly what she was accused of being. The hospital staff saw it. Nurses she'd worked beside for years. Doctors who'd trusted her with their most critical patients. The cafeteria workers who knew her coffee order. Security guards who'd walked her to her car on late shifts. Everyone saw it, and almost no one spoke up for her. It wasn't that they didn't want to. Some of them knew in their gut that something was wrong, that Sarah Mitchell wasn't capable of theft, that this didn't make sense. But speaking up meant drawing attention to yourself. It meant questioning the CEO's narrative. It meant potentially becoming the next target. Fear is a powerful silencer. Dr. Chun, who'd witnessed the arrest, who'd heard Sarah begging to be allowed to reach Mr. Johnson, said nothing publicly. He told himself he'd wait to see how things developed. Wait for more information. He told himself a lot of things that let him sleep at night. Nurse Peterson, who'd arrived at room 347 too late, who knew exactly how critical those missing minutes had been, stayed silent. She had a mortgage. 2 kids in college. She couldn't afford to lose her job over someone else's problem. One by one, Sarah's colleagues made the same calculation. Self-preservation over solidarity. It's easy to judge them for it until you're the one deciding whether to risk everything. The State Board of Nursing suspended Sarah's license pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Standard procedure for any nurse facing felony charges. It didn't matter that she hadn't been convicted. Didn't matter that she hadn't even had her day in court. The arrest alone was enough. Without a nursing license, she couldn't work as a nurse. Without being able to work as a nurse, she had no income. Her savings, modest to begin with after years of student loans and the cost of living on a nurse's salary, started hemorrhaging into legal fees. The public defender she'd been assigned was overworked and underpaid, handling 70 cases simultaneously. He advised her to take a plea deal, plead guilty to a lesser charge, accept probation, move on with her life. He said it kindly, tiredly, like someone who'd given the same advice 1,000 times to 1,000 other people who couldn't afford better representation. Sarah refused. She hadn't stolen anything. Wouldn't plead guilty to something she didn't do. Couldn't live with that mark on her record, that stain on her identity as a nurse. So she hired a private attorney, drained her savings, borrowed money from her parents who didn't have money to lend, but did it anyway, because that's what parents do. went into debt for the privilege of defending herself against charges that were fabricated from the start. She applied to other hospitals, other clinics, anywhere that might hire a nurse, even temporarily, even part-time. Every background check came back flagged, pending criminal charges. Every interview ended the same way. We'll be in touch. They never were. She took a job at a grocery store, stocking shelves, minimum wage. The kind of work she'd done in high school before nursing school, before she'd built a career, before she'd become someone who saved lives for a living. Her coworkers were kind but curious. What was someone with a nursing degree doing stocking cereal boxes? She couldn't explain. The shame was too heavy. Friends started drifting away. Not overtly. No one said, "I can't be associated with you anymore." But invitations stopped coming. Text messages went unanswered a little longer. Plans got canceled a little more frequently. People are uncomfortable around misfortune, especially the kind that might be contagious. Sarah spent her evenings in a studio apartment she'd moved to because she couldn't afford her old place. Sat in the dark sometimes because even electricity felt like an extravagance now. Wondered how her life had collapsed so completely in such a short time. Wondered if she'd ever get it back. For 8 months, Sarah lived in this darkness. But someone refused to let her story end there. Maya Chin had been Sarah's friend since nursing school. While Sarah studied medicine, Maya studied computer science and network security. And Maya knew something that Thornton didn't. Hospitals run on digital systems. And digital systems keep records. They'd met in a statistics class required for both their programs. Sarah struggling through probability distributions and data analysis. Maya breezing through it, but struggling to stay awake during lectures that felt insultingly basic. They'd been paired for a group project. Sarah brought coffee and dedication. Maya brought genius and irreverence. Somehow it worked. They'd stayed close through the years, even as their careers diverged. Sarah saving lives in the ICU. Maya working for a cybersecurity firm, getting paid absurd amounts of money to find vulnerabilities in corporate networks before malicious hackers could exploit them. She was what the industry called a white hat, an ethical hacker who broke into systems to make them stronger. When Sarah was arrested, Maya's first reaction was anger. Not at Sarah. At the audacity of whoever had fabricated this obvious frame job. Because Maya knew Sarah. Knew her character with the certainty that comes from a decade of friendship. Sarah Mitchell would give away her last dollar to someone in need. The idea of her stealing was laughable. Her second reaction was to start digging. Maya didn't ask Sarah's permission. Didn't tell her what she was planning. If Sarah knew, she'd object. Would say it was too risky, too dangerous, that Maya could lose her job, or worse. Would insist on handling things through proper legal channels, even though those channels were clearly failing her. So Maya worked in secret, came home from her day job, and spent her nights doing what she did best, finding the truth hidden in digital systems. She started with publicly available information. Court records, news reports, the hospital's official statements. All of it surface level, all of it useless. Then she moved deeper. Hospital networks are notoriously complex. Multiple systems that don't talk to each other properly. Electronic health records, inventory management, badge access logs, security cameras, payroll. Each system built by different contractors, running different software, with different security protocols. It's a digital maze. Maya had skills, but she wasn't magic. She couldn't just snap her fingers and access St. Augustine's internal networks. They had firewalls, encryption, security monitoring. Break in too obviously and she'd trigger alerts, potentially destroying evidence or getting herself arrested. She needed to be patient, methodical, invisible. She started by mapping the hospital's digital infrastructure from the outside, identifying weak points, old systems that hadn't been updated, vendor access portals that might have inadequate security, employee email accounts that might be vulnerable to social engineering. Week 1, nothing, just learning the architecture, understanding how data flowed through the organization. Week 2, she found a vulnerability in a third-party billing system, got access to basic records, invoices. Nothing useful for Sarah's case, but proof she could get inside. Week 3, dead end. The inventory system was more secure than she'd hoped. Modern encryption, no obvious backdoors. Week 4, frustration mounting. She'd spent 20 hours staring at code, trying to find a way into the badge access logs, the records that would show when Sarah allegedly accessed supply rooms. The system was locked down tight. Maya started to doubt herself. Started to wonder if maybe the digital evidence had been destroyed, or if it existed only on paper, beyond her reach, or if Thornton had been smart enough to cover his tracks completely. She'd call Sarah every few days, just to check in, never mentioning what she was doing, listening to her friend's voice grow quieter, more defeated with each conversation, hearing the hope drain away. It made Maya work harder. Month 2. She got into the employee portal through a phishing email sent to an HR administrator. Got access to personnel files. Found Sarah's termination paperwork. The charges listed. The evidence cited. All of it pointing to the inventory records and badge access logs she still couldn't reach. Month 3. She tried a different approach. Instead of hacking the hospital directly, she went after the security company that installed the badge readers. Their servers had backups of client data, less secure than the hospital's own systems because they were overseeing hundreds of facilities. She spent 2 weeks probing their network before she found it, an unpatched vulnerability in their archive system. She was in, but the data was corrupted, incomplete, fragments of access logs from months ago. Nothing concrete, nothing that would hold up as evidence. Another dead end. Month 4, Maya was exhausted, working her regular job during the day, spending 6 to 8 hours every night hunting through digital shadows. Her boss had started noticing her fatigue, her performance slipping. She didn't care. Sarah was stocking shelves at a grocery store. Sarah was drowning in legal debt. Sarah was being destroyed by lies. Maya would find the truth if it took years. Month 5. She shifted focus to the hospital's security camera system. Different network, different vendor, different vulnerabilities. She researched the specific model they used. Found forum posts from other security researchers who'd identified weaknesses. Started testing. Month 6. Progress. She got read-only access to the camera management interface. Could see the directory structure. Could see that footage was archived going back 18 months. But she couldn't download anything. Couldn't view the actual video files. Just metadata. Just proof they existed. Month 7. She found a workaround. The camera system had a maintenance portal for technicians. Lighter security because it was assumed only authorized personnel would know it existed. She got in. Started browsing archived footage. Hundreds of cameras. Thousands of hours of video. Finding the right footage from the right camera at the right time would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. Month 8. Maya was running on coffee and rage. Sarah's trial date was approaching. Once that started, it would be harder to introduce new evidence. She was running out of time. She focused on November 14th, the day of the arrest. Started with cameras in the ICU wing. 3rd floor. There had to be something. There had to be. She worked systematically. Camera by camera. Hallway by hallway. Frame by frame when she found anything promising. And then, on a random Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., Maya found it. Security camera 347B, hallway junction, 3rd floor, ICU wing. November 14th, 2:17 to 2:23 p.m. 6 minutes that would change everything. Maya's screen showed the timestamp in the corner. The hallway was quiet at first. Normal hospital activity. A doctor walking past with a chart. An orderly pushing a meal cart. The mundane rhythm of an institution that never sleeps. Then Sarah appeared in frame. She was running. Not jogging. Not hurrying. Running with the full speed of someone who understood that seconds mattered. The crash cart rattled behind her. One wheel slightly off-kilter, making it veer left until she corrected. Her face was focused, intense, the expression of a professional doing what they were trained to do. Maya leaned closer to her screen. Watched Sarah's trajectory. She was heading directly toward room 347. Moving with purpose. With urgency. With absolutely no indication of someone who'd just committed theft or who had any reason to feel guilty about anything. Then the elevator doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. Their appearance was jarring against the clinical backdrop of the hospital. Dark uniforms. Heavy belts laden with equipment. They moved with the casual authority of people used to being obeyed. Maya watched them scan the hallway. Watched their eyes lock onto Sarah. Watched them adjust their path to intercept her. Sarah didn't see them at first. Her attention was ahead, on the room where a man was dying. The crash cart blocked her peripheral vision on one side. She was in the zone, that state of hyper-focus emergency responders enter when lives hang in the balance. The lead officer raised his hand. Sarah stopped, finally noticed them. Her body language changed instantly. Confusion, then recognition of who they were. then a gesture toward the corridor ahead. She was explaining something. The camera had no audio, but Maya didn't need sound to understand what Sarah was saying. There's an emergency. I need to get through. Someone is dying. The officer's response was to move closer, to put his hand on her arm. Sarah tried to pull away, not violently, not resisting arrest, just trying to continue toward her patient, trying to do her job. The second officer moved to her other side, boxed her in. Sarah's mouth was moving rapidly now, pleading. Her free hand pointed up the hallway repeatedly. Desperate gestures toward room 347. Then the handcuffs came out. Maya watched Sarah's face crumble, watched the exact moment when she understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved, that they were actually arresting her, that they weren't going to let her reach her patient. Sarah's body went through a visible transformation, fighting, then begging, then something that looked like breaking. Her shoulders sagged. Her head dropped forward. The lead officer was reading her rights. Maya could tell from the practiced cadence of his mouth movements, the way he was going through motions he'd performed 1,000 times. Other staff members appeared in frame. Frozen, uncertain. Dr. Chin stood in the background, his coffee cup forgotten. Nurse Peterson emerged from a doorway, hand over her mouth. No one intervened. No one could. Then Maya saw it. In the background of the frame, through the interior windows that let natural light into the corridor, a figure standing at a fourth-floor window looking down. The angle was steep, but the camera's position captured it. A man in a suit. Watching. Maya enhanced the image. Zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The man's face became clearer. Features she'd seen before in news articles about the hospital, in the professional photos on St. Augustine's leadership page. Marcus Thornton. Standing at his office window, watching Sarah being arrested. And if Maya wasn't mistaken, if the pixelation wasn't playing tricks, he was smiling. She saved the footage. Backed it up 3 different ways. Cloud storage. External drive. Email to herself. This was the evidence that would destroy him. But she wasn't done yet. Maya went back through the archive. Started pulling footage from the supply rooms. The places where Sarah had allegedly stolen equipment. The timestamps in Thornton's falsified access logs gave her exact dates and times to check. November 2nd, 2:47 a.m. The access log claimed Sarah's badge had opened supply room C. Maya pulled up the camera footage from that room at that timestamp. Sarah wasn't there. An orderly was. Male. Late 30s. Moving quickly, nervously. He unlocked the supply cabinet with a key, not a badge. Removed 2 pumps. Looked around like he was afraid of being caught. Left. Maya ran his face through the hospital employee database she'd accessed weeks ago. Found his name. Dennis Walsh. Hired 6 months ago. Minimal background. One previous employer reference that Maya suspected was fabricated. She pulled footage from every timestamp in the falsified logs. November 7th. November 12th. November 19th. Every single time, the same pattern. Dennis Walsh entering supply rooms when the logs claimed Sarah had been there. Dennis Walsh removing equipment. Dennis Walsh being careful, methodical, following someone's instructions. Being paid by someone to frame Sarah Mitchell. Maya's hands were shaking as she downloaded the footage. 8 months of work. 8 months of dead ends and frustration and nearly giving up. And here it was. Proof. Undeniable. Timestamp verified. Camera recorded proof. The footage showed Sarah responding to an emergency, not fleeing a crime scene. Showed her being arrested while trying to save a life. Showed Thornton watching it happen. Showed the real thief, someone else entirely, doing exactly what Sarah had been accused of. It showed everything. Maya sat back in her chair, staring at her screen. The sun was coming up outside her apartment window. She'd been at this for 11 hours straight. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Her eyes burned from screen fatigue. But she'd found it. She thought about calling Sarah immediately. Imagined her friend's voice, the hope that had been ground down to almost nothing over these months. Imagined telling her that it was over, that the truth was about to come out. But Maya was a strategist. Calling Sarah now, in the middle of the night, would just be emotional relief. It wouldn't change anything legally. Wouldn't stop the trial. Wouldn't clear Sarah's name. Maya needed to be smart about this. Needed to make sure this evidence couldn't be buried or dismissed or explained away by expensive lawyers. Needed to make sure the truth got out in a way that couldn't be stopped. She started researching journalists who'd covered wrongful prosecution cases. investigative reporters with reputations for taking on powerful institutions, media outlets that wouldn't be intimidated by hospital attorneys. She found 3 names, started drafting emails, attached the footage, wrote detailed explanations of what the videos showed, what they proved, what they meant. If you can't stand when powerful people rig the system, comment "No more corruption." Every comment tells YouTube this story matters. Don't let the algorithm bury the truth like Thornton tried to bury Sarah. Maya hit send on all 3 emails just as dawn broke fully over the city. Then she allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. One moment of knowing that she'd done it. That she'd kept her promise to her friend even though Sarah never knew the promise had been made. Then she started preparing for what came next. Because once this footage went public, everything was going to explode. Maya didn't go to the hospital. She didn't go to the police. She went to the people. She'd learned something working in cybersecurity. Institutions protect themselves. Police departments protect their officers. Hospitals protect their executives. Even when presented with evidence of wrongdoing, the instinct is always damage control first, justice second. The truth gets buried in internal investigations and non-disclosure agreements and settlements that come with gag orders. Maya wasn't going to let that happen. She chose her target carefully. Jennifer Ramirez, investigative journalist at the city's largest independent news station. 20 years in the business. A reputation for stories that made powerful people uncomfortable. She'd broken corruption cases before, knew how to protect sources, knew how to handle evidence that could get suppressed if the wrong people found out about it too early. Maya sent the email at 6:43 in the morning. Anonymous email account. Encrypted attachment. Subject line. Hospital CEO frames nurse who questioned his decisions. The email contained everything. The security footage from the arrest. The supply room videos showing Dennis Walsh. The falsified access logs. The timeline of events. A detailed explanation of what it all meant. And one request. Release it publicly before anyone can bury it. Jennifer Ramirez opened that email at 7:15, 2 minutes after arriving at her desk with her first coffee of the day. She watched the footage 3 times. Called her producer. Called the station's lawyer. By 8:30, they'd verified enough details to move forward. But Maya didn't wait for the news station. She knew how these things worked. Editorial review. Legal vetting. Management approval. Even a story this explosive could get delayed by institutional caution. So she did something that traditional journalists couldn't. She went straight to social media. Anonymous accounts. Impossible to trace back to her. She uploaded the arrest footage to every platform simultaneously. Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. Each post with the same caption. This nurse was arrested while running to save a dying patient. The CEO ordered it because she questioned his decisions. The patient lost his leg because of the delay. This is what happens when power goes unchecked. She included timestamps, context, links to news articles about Sarah's arrest. Made it easy for people to understand exactly what they were watching. The first post got 12 shares in the first hour, then 40, then 200. Social media algorithms are designed to promote content that generates strong reactions. And this footage generated rage. By noon, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. By 2 p.m., 500,000. The engagement was explosive. Comment sections filled with outrage. People sharing their own stories of medical system failures, of corrupt administrators, of good people destroyed by institutions that protected the powerful. The hashtag emerged organically. Justice for Sarah. Within hours it was trending locally. By evening, it was trending nationally. Jennifer Ramirez's news story aired at 6 p.m., but by then millions of people had already seen the footage. Her report added professional credibility, additional context, expert interviews with medical ethicists and legal analysts. But the story was already out there, already spreading, already beyond anyone's ability to control. Other news outlets scrambled to catch up. By 7 p.m., every major network in the region was covering it. By 8 p.m., national outlets picked it up. Cable news channels, online publications. The story had everything they wanted. Corruption, injustice, clear villains and victims, and footage that made it impossible to deny or spin. St. Augustine Medical Center's phone system crashed from the volume of calls. Angry citizens demanding answers. Former patients horrified to learn what had happened. Donors threatening to withdraw funding. Lawyers sniffing around for potential lawsuits. The hospital's social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding accountability. Their carefully curated posts about community health initiatives and medical breakthroughs were buried under thousands of replies calling them corrupt, calling for Thornton's resignation, calling for justice. Marcus Thornton watched it unfold from his office, the same office where he'd stood 8 months ago watching Sarah being arrested. He could see his carefully constructed narrative disintegrating in real time. His assistant kept bringing him messages. Board members calling emergency meetings. Lawyers advising silence. PR consultants trying to craft damage control. At 8:45 p.m., against the advice of every professional around him, Thornton released a statement. The security footage circulating today has been taken out of context. The arrest of former employee Sarah Mitchell was based on substantial evidence of theft that was thoroughly investigated. The timing of the arrest was unfortunate, but law enforcement determines their own procedures. St. Augustine Medical Center maintains its commitment to the highest standards of integrity and patient care. The statement lasted approximately 11 minutes before the internet tore it apart. Out of context, the timestamps were visible. The full footage was available. Substantial evidence? Where was it? Law enforcement determines procedures? They'd arrested her during a code blue on hospital property. Every line of Thornton's statement became ammunition. Legal experts went on television explaining how the statement was essentially an admission that the hospital knew about the timing. Medical professionals called it unconscionable. Former St. Augustine employees, emboldened by public support, started coming forward with stories of Thornton's other questionable decisions. The snowball had become an avalanche. Sarah learned about it from a customer at the grocery store. She was stocking shelves in the cereal aisle when a woman approached her. "Are you Sarah Mitchell, the nurse from the video?" Sarah's first instinct was shame. Another person recognizing her from her mugshot. Another moment of humiliation. She started to turn away. "You're a hero," the woman said. "What they did to you is criminal. Everyone's talking about it. It's all over the news." Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Saw the notifications. Hundreds of them. Messages from people she hadn't heard from in months. Former colleagues finally feeling safe enough to reach out. Strangers offering support. And there, trending at number 3 nationally, #JusticeForSarah. She clicked on it. Watched the security footage of her own arrest for the first time. Watched herself begging to be allowed to save Mr. Johnson. Watched Thornton in the background window. She sat down in the middle of the cereal aisle and cried. But this time, for the first time in 8 months, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of vindication, of relief, of hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally going to matter. Once the public saw the truth, there was no putting it back in the box. The walls were about to come down. When the FBI gets involved, that's when people start running. The viral footage didn't just embarrass St. Augustine Medical Center. It triggered something much more serious. Federal interest. Because what the video showed wasn't just hospital politics or employment disputes. It showed a potential conspiracy to violate civil rights. It showed the deliberate arrest of a medical professional during an emergency, resulting in patient harm. It showed what looked an awful lot like corruption. The state medical board moved first. They'd suspended Sarah's license based on criminal charges that now looked fabricated. That made them look complicit, even if unintentionally. Within 48 hours of the footage going public, they announced a full investigation into the circumstances of her arrest and the evidence used to justify it. Then came the FBI. Civil rights violations. Conspiracy. Deprivation of rights under color of law. The kind of charges that carry serious federal prison time. They don't investigate these cases unless they believe something genuinely criminal occurred. And after watching that footage, after seeing the timeline, after hearing from medical experts about how the delay directly caused Mr. Johnson's amputation, they believed. The hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting, not because they cared about Sarah Mitchell, because they cared about their institution's survival, about their own liability, about the donor money that was already being pulled, about the lawsuits that were inevitably coming. They announced their own internal investigation, hired an outside law firm to review everything, brought in forensic accountants to examine financial records, made public statements about their commitment to transparency and accountability. All the things institutions do when they're trying to distance themselves from a scandal while it's still unfolding. What they found was worse than they'd imagined. The forensic accountants started with the inventory records, the evidence that had been used to justify Sarah's arrest. They brought in IT specialists who understood digital forensics, who knew how to examine metadata, who could tell when documents had been created versus when they claimed to have been created. The inventory records had been altered, not by some sophisticated hacking from outside, from inside, from an administrator account with CEO-level access. The modifications had been made over a 6-week period. Methodical, careful. Someone who knew the system well enough to make changes that would look legitimate on the surface. They traced the access logs. Every modification came from the same account, Marcus Thornton's. Then they found the payments. Hospital accounts had a discretionary fund that the CEO could access for operational expenses. It was meant for things like emergency equipment purchases, facility repairs, professional consultants. Thornton had used it for something else entirely. $5,000 to Dennis Walsh, the orderly, paid through a fake consulting company that existed only on paper. The payment dated 2 weeks before Sarah's arrest, labeled as inventory management consulting. There was no consulting, just cash for Walsh to take equipment and keep his mouth shut. $10,000 split between 2 recipients with addresses that matched officers Bradley and Martinez, paid through another shell company, labeled as security assessment services. There was no security assessment, just payment for making an arrest without asking questions. The communications were even more damning. Thornton had been careful, hadn't used his hospital email, but he'd used his personal phone for some communications. And when the FBI subpoenaed his phone records, they found text messages to a number that belonged to Officer Bradley. Everything in place for Tuesday. Confirmed. 2 p.m. window. Make sure it's public. Maximum visibility. And most damning of all, sent the morning of Sarah's arrest. She'll be on the 3rd floor. Don't let her reach the patient. The FBI brought in specialists to trace the equipment that had allegedly been stolen. Medical devices have serial numbers, registration records. They tracked down every piece of equipment listed in Thornton's falsified inventory reports. They found them in a storage unit rented under another fake company name. A storage unit whose lease payments came from that same CEO discretionary fund. The equipment had never been stolen. Thornton had moved it himself, piece by piece, creating the appearance of theft. He'd planned to discover it later, maybe in Sarah's home after a search warrant, maybe in her car. Evidence that would seal her conviction and his revenge. But he'd moved too fast. The arrest had gone public before he could plant the final pieces. And then the footage leaked, and suddenly his carefully constructed frame job was exposed before he could complete it. The investigators found spreadsheets on Thornton's personal laptop, planning documents, timelines, lists of equipment to disappear, notes about Sarah's schedule, calculations about the best time to strike. He documented his own conspiracy with the meticulous attention to detail of someone who never imagined he'd be caught. One note, buried in a folder labeled HR Issues, was particularly chilling. Mitchell embarrassed me in front of the board. Needs to be made an example. Career destruction minimum. Criminal conviction ideal. Other staff must see what happens when they question leadership. It wasn't just revenge. It was a message. A warning to every other nurse, every other doctor, every other staff member who might think about speaking up. Challenge the CEO and he'll destroy your life. The hospital board reviewed the findings in a closed-door meeting that lasted 7 hours. Board members who'd praised Thornton's leadership 6 months ago now scrambled to figure out how to protect themselves. Their lawyers were clear. The institution was exposed to massive liability. Criminal liability for the conspiracy. Civil liability for Sarah's damages and Mr. Johnson's injury. Regulatory liability from state and federal healthcare authorities. They had one option to minimize the damage. Complete cooperation with investigators. Full transparency. An immediate termination of Marcus Thornton. They voted unanimously. Self-preservation always wins. But termination wasn't enough. The FBI had enough evidence to move forward. Arrest warrants were prepared. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury. The charges were extensive. Conspiracy, wire fraud, deprivation of rights under color of law, filing false police reports, criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm. Marcus Thornton was about to learn that destroying someone's life has consequences, even for people who thought they were untouchable. November 14th, the following year. Exactly 1 year after Sarah's arrest. The irony was not lost on anyone. Marcus Thornton woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of his doorbell ringing. Persistent. Insistent. the kind of ringing that meant someone wasn't going away. He pulled on a robe, irritated, assuming it was a delivery or a neighbor with some trivial complaint. He opened the door to 8 FBI agents in tactical gear. "Marcus Thornton, you're under arrest." They didn't give him time to process. Didn't give him time to call his lawyer or put on proper clothes or maintain any shred of the dignity he'd spent his career cultivating. They read him his rights while agents spread through his home, executing a search warrant, collecting computers and phones and documents. His wife stood at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, watching her husband being handcuffed in their marble foyer. The same foyer where they'd hosted hospital board members for dinner parties, where they'd celebrated his promotions and bonuses, where he'd built the appearance of success. The charges were read aloud. Conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. Wire fraud. Filing false police reports. Criminal negligence resulting in serious bodily injury. Each charge carried years of federal prison time. Together, they added up to decades. The perp walk was deliberate. The FBI made sure of it. They walked Thornton out his front door in handcuffs and a bathrobe, past his manicured lawn, past his luxury cars in the circular driveway, into a waiting vehicle. And the media was there, cameras rolling. Reporters shouting questions. The same news stations that had shown Sarah's mugshot a year ago now showed Marcus Thornton's fall from grace. The contrast was striking. Sarah in her wrinkled scrubs, eyes red from crying, looking devastated. Thornton in expensive silk pajamas under a cashmere robe, looking furious and entitled even in handcuffs. 2 hours later, Officers Bradley and Martinez were arrested at their respective homes. Same charges. Conspiracy. Deprivation of rights. They'd taken Thornton's money and made an arrest they knew was wrong. During an emergency they knew was critical. They'd chosen payment over duty. Dennis Walsh, the orderly, was arrested at a bus station trying to leave the state. He'd seen the news coverage, knew the investigation was closing in, tried to run. It didn't matter. They found him within 6 hours. Thornton's bail hearing was a spectacle. His lawyers argued for reasonable bail, argued that he was a respected medical professional, a pillar of the community, not a flight risk. The prosecutor presented evidence differently, showed the forged documents, the shell companies, the offshore account they discovered where Thornton had been moving money, the passport with recent stamps to non-extradition countries. Bail was set at $2 million. Thornton sat in that courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit because he hadn't been allowed to change, and listened to his life being dismantled in legal language. His assets were being frozen pending civil suits. His medical license was under emergency review. The hospital had already terminated his contract and announced they'd be suing him for damages and reputational harm. He couldn't make bail. The frozen assets meant he couldn't access the money. His parents were middle-class retirees who didn't have that kind of cash. His friends, the powerful connections he'd cultivated over years, suddenly stopped returning calls. Marcus Thornton, who'd orchestrated Sarah's destruction with surgical precision, spent his first night in the same county jail where Sarah had spent hers. But Sarah had been released the next day. Thornton would be there for months awaiting trial. His wife filed for divorce within the week. Not because of the charges necessarily, because of what the investigation revealed. The mistress she hadn't known about. The second set of financial records showing money he'd hidden from her. The man she thought she'd married turned out to be someone else entirely. His daughter, a sophomore at Duke, changed her last name. Didn't want to be associated with him anymore. Couldn't walk across campus without people recognizing the name Thornton from news coverage. His son refused to visit him in jail. Everything Marcus Thornton had built, reputation, career, family, freedom, collapsed in the span of days. The same way Sarah's life had collapsed. The same suddenness. The same totality. Except Sarah had been innocent. And Thornton had orchestrated his own destruction through arrogance and cruelty. Officers Bradley and Martinez made plea deals. Testified against Thornton in exchange for reduced sentences. 5 years each. They'd spend half a decade in prison for taking a corrupt payment to make an arrest they knew was wrong. Dennis Walsh got 3 years in probation. He'd cooperated early, provided evidence, shown genuine remorse. The judge acknowledged he'd been used by someone with more power, but also made clear that following illegal orders didn't absolve responsibility. The investigation expanded. Federal prosecutors looked into Thornton's entire tenure as CEO, found other questionable decisions. Other instances of retaliation against staff who questioned him. a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. None of it rose to criminal charges, but it painted a picture of a man who'd been abusing power long before he targeted Sarah Mitchell. If you believe this is what accountability looks like, smash that like button. Share this story so others know that truth wins, even when it takes time. Comment, power has limits if you're done with people like Thornton. The media covered every development. The story had everything they wanted. A clear villain getting his comeuppance. A victim vindicated. Justice served in a way that felt satisfying and complete. Cable news ran segments. Podcasts devoted episodes to analyzing what went wrong. Ethics professors used the case in their classes as an example of institutional corruption. And through it all, Marcus Thornton sat in a jail cell, wearing clothes that didn't cost thousands of dollars, eating food he didn't choose, following schedules he didn't set, powerless in a way he'd never experienced. Finally understanding what it felt like to have your life controlled by people who didn't care about your humanity. The trial was still months away, but everyone already knew how it would end. The charges against Sarah Mitchell were formally dropped on November 18th. But that was just the beginning of her restoration. Her nursing license was reinstated with a formal commendation. The hospital board offered a public apology. Sarah rejected it. "You protected your CEO and threw me away," she told them. "I don't accept your apology, but I will accept your money and a position to ensure this never happens again." The settlement was undisclosed. Estimates range from $8 to $12 million. Mr. Johnson's family received a separate settlement. Sarah became director of patient advocacy with real authority to implement reforms. Maya Chun received national recognition and started the Digital Justice Initiative. Marcus Thornton's trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury took 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, civil rights violations, wire fraud, criminal negligence. The verdict was read in a packed courtroom while Thornton sat stone-faced, his expensive lawyers unable to overcome the mountain of evidence against him. Sentencing came 2 months later. 12 years in federal prison. No parole on federal charges. He'd serve at least 10 years minimum. Officers Bradley and Martinez received 5 years each. Dennis Walsh got 3 years with probation after. Sarah testified during the trial. Faced Thornton directly across the courtroom. "You tried to destroy me to protect your ego. Instead, you exposed yourself." He looked away. Today, 3 years later, Sarah Mitchell serves as director of patient advocacy at a major hospital network. She speaks nationally on healthcare reform and workplace ethics. She's married with 2 children. Still a nurse at heart. Maya Chun runs the Digital Justice Initiative, exposing institutional corruption through technology. She testified before Congress on data transparency. Mr. Johnson recovered. Uses a prosthetic. Advocates for patient rights. He and Sarah remained close friends. Marcus Thornton sits in federal prison. No parole until 2032. His case is taught in healthcare ethics courses as a cautionary tale. Hospitals implemented independent oversight boards. Several states proposed Sarah's law, protecting healthcare workers who report safety concerns.